we come to round 2 in Bahrain of the Formula 1 World Championship, and a weekend where the cars have really been developing in 2 types of ways. First of all, Bahrain's a very different circuit. You have the heat, you have the long straights, and you have much faster corners than we saw in Melbourne. That puts lots of stress on the brakes and on the engines. But equally, we have the teams learning their cars. They've had now 8 days of testing. They've had the 3 days of Melbourne and Bahrain and a 2-week gap in between in order to further develop these cars. So we're seeing lots of updates on the cars. Every car up and down the grid had changed its cooling outlets in order to cope with the Bahrain heat. They played about with their brake duct settings, which again is just the typical part of the circuit by circuit changes they make to the car. And equally, they will have played about with developments which they were either planning to bring to Bahrain anyway, which would have been signed off long before Melbourne, plus some detail changes as a result of what they found in Melbourne. So Bahrain, very much the start of the race by race development that we will see throughout the year. Ferrari really changed the pace that they produced at Bahrain, but unfortunately not the results as a result of unreliability and race incidents. But if we go back, we can now look through testing, we can look at what happened in Melbourne and what happened in Bahrain. We've now got 3 sets of data to understand what Ferrari are doing with this car. Clearly Melbourne was a blip where they really were struggling, but we can now really understand where Ferrari's pace and performance comes from, when the reasons we had problems in Melbourne are starting to explain that for us as well. First of all, the Ferrari is a very fast car, there's no question about that. They've certainly got the pace on a par with Mercedes, perhaps even a little bit step ahead of it, but it's how it produces this performance that's really interesting. So we look at some of the corner speed data and we look at the sector data, we can see clearly that Ferrari is very fast in a straight line. That's evident, and that comes from 2 things. It comes from the engine power and it comes from the drag setup that they have on the car. Clearly Ferrari have plenty of power in this new power unit. It really made a step up over the winter despite regulation changes, which perhaps with the oil burning and with some of the other factors like the twin batteries that were suggested was part of last year's pace being outlawed, Ferrari still have made a big step there. But then we start to come to look at where the car is fast through the corners. Through slow corners, medium speed corners, Ferrari is particularly struggling. And we saw this very much in Melbourne as one of the main reasons they were struggling in Melbourne. Equally with the brakes into these corners, where they're obviously going from high speed down to medium or low speed for the corners. So I think what we're finding is that perhaps Ferrari, with this engine power, are still running quite a low drag car, therefore a very low downforce car. They're really going for efficiency rather than sheer downforce. And this is what's starting to trouble them through the low speed corners, medium speed corners. Not so much for the downforce, but I think they do have a mechanical imbalance. The front axle is quite sensitive on the Ferrari. We heard the drivers saying they were struggling on the brakes and struggling in the low medium speed corners, both in Bahrain and particularly in Melbourne, but equally Sector 3 back in Barcelona. So again, we see the sort of the data stacking up here. Then we can see that the Mercedes is much quicker in high-speed corners, which again suggests that Ferrari is struggling with downforce, or is choosing not to run downforce, probably the best way of putting it, in order to have this low drag car, get the performance through the straights. Now, this is all well and good. It's clearly bringing lap time for Ferrari when it's working, as we saw in Bahrain. However, this could be storing up problems for the future. We know that Mercedes will fight back, particularly with a more powerful engine as the season progresses. But what you'll find is that Ferrari are struggling with low speed mechanical grip on the front axle and struggling in high speed corners because of downforce. This then starts to create problems for the tyres, particularly in the race, not so much in qualifying, again as we saw superb qualifying performance from both Ferraris in Bahrain. But if this carries on through the race, then the tyres will start to go away much quicker because they're sliding, they will start to overheat, and we know these Pirellis degrade very quickly, particularly if you go fast very early on in a stint. So Ferrari really need to keep an eye on what's going on. In terms of developments for Bahrain, we really saw nothing evident on the car that was different. This is all about the setup and how much they've been able to release that engine power because of reliability concerns through the Australian weekend. Clearly they've come back to bite them in the race this weekend in Bahrain, so we'll have to see where Ferrari come back out when we go to China, another circuit with very long straights, but equally with some very difficult slow speed sections, so the balance there is quite difficult for Ferrari. Equally going on to Baku, so it will be Barcelona I think before Ferrari are back on full colour with this car. Mercedes came out of Bahrain with a result which they really weren't expecting. The performance advantage they had through Melbourne was reversed by almost the same amount, so Ferrari almost gained 2 seconds between Melbourne and Bahrain. I think that doesn't tell the entire story of the setup differences between the circuit and between the two cars. But equally, Mercedes, again, like we've seen with Ferrari, we're starting to understand where that car has its pace. The car is very quick through fast corners, nothing quicker than the Mercedes through fast turns. The car clearly has lots of downforce and it has the balance in those situations. And it's very close with Ferrari on the low and medium speed corners. So Mercedes clearly are losing the pace on the straights. Now, through winter testing, looking at the sector times and by speaking to people in the paddock, as I understand, Mercedes aren't really happy with this 2019 engine that they've got. They haven't made the step over the winter that they were expecting, and I wouldn't say the engine is down on power, but I don't think they've made the step upwards that they were perhaps expecting over the winter. And this is starting to hurt Mercedes because their aero concept is very much downforce focused. They're not really worried too much about reducing drag. They're just trying to do everything to get that car working, to get as much downforce through the tyres to the track as possible. As a result, this then creates problems for them. It's great if they're on pole and they can lead away from the race, but clearly if they are now looking to have to overtake Ferraris and potentially Red Bulls later in the season through the year, it's this power unit they're going to have to work on. It's a 21 race season, which means the 3 engines, each of them have to last 7 races, so we are looking at Canada before Mercedes can really fight back with a different power unit, which means between now and then they've got to look at things like fuel and oil developments. They've got to look at the mapping of the engine, and they've also got to think about how much drag they want to run on this race. Now, this weekend in Bahrain there was a new rear wing set up, very much focused on the end plates, and what they had is the 2 hanging vanes, which were initially in Melbourne, up to 3 hanging vanes for Bahrain, and these just turn the airflow out through the rear wing, makes the rear wing more efficient, makes it expand more air, which means you get more downforce for a given drag level, which is clearly what Mercedes are trying to do here. They've also run a T-wing, which again at first would suggest that this is quite a draggy device trying to add downforce. But again, I think what we're seeing here is that Mercedes are very much focusing on downforce and are now trying to ease back on the drag that comes with that in order to become competitive with Ferraris. I think we'll find the Mercedes and the Ferrari get closer to each other in terms of their downforce drag setup through the year, particularly as their engines equal out in performance. Renault brought updates to their car, the RS19 in Australia. They've also brought them to Bahrain. Now it's the barge boards. The changes that we saw to the front wing back in Melbourne are retained. They've actually added a gurney flap again to this front wing area. But it's the barge boards which have changed. And it's the first of 3 teams that we'll talk about with barge boards changes for Bahrain. Very much a very powerful area of the car where teams have already got lots of understanding of how these work. So we may see barge boards developing quicker than the front wings in some respects. Now, the 3 teams we'll talk about, Renault really made the smallest changes to their barge boards, and it's to do with the foot plate, which is the flat horizontal section that runs along the bottom of the barge boards in front of the side pods behind the rear wheels. And what they've done is there's just a vane that was running along and was truncated quite short. This has now been extended to about half the length of the entire barge board foot plate, and isn't a huge change, but just shows you the detail changes that teams bring to each race. And this will just help change the way that the barge boards produce outwash, but equally how they change the pressure distribution under the floor, which feeds the diffuser with the correct airflow levels in order to get the most downforce from the underbody. So Renault making smaller changes, and we'll now come on to some of the bigger changes. McLaren, another team with barge board changes. Didn't see much else change on the car, but clearly we can see that there is this performance now in the MCL 34 that we haven't seen from McLaren in recent seasons. The Renault power unit working very well for them now in this chassis. Very different setup to how they've implemented the Renault power unit in the chassis this year compared with last year as well. So McLaren and Renault learning in their relationship through these first couple of seasons. If we now look at the barge boards going back to the car's launch, we saw this very square edge front to the barge boards, this element that we call the boomerang, which is a wing that creates a little bit of downwash that sits up and over the barge board package. And McLaren had this very stylised setup, very square edged. This boomerang now has changed and it slopes down much more from the chassis to the front of the side pods, which means that the wake and the tip vortices it produced just mounted that little bit lower, makes them easier to go towards the floor to create pressure over the diffuser for more downforce. That change quite visible, but tucked in the rectangle that the boomerang at the front of the barge boards produces, we can see that there's a new package of vanes, front turning vanes, 6 elements all arranged inside this little square section, and again they're just turning the airflow, spinning up all the vortices coming through from the front wing of the Y250 area and the barge board outwash, just building that airflow up. And this is quite interesting because this now shows us that McLaren are quite comfortable with the car. We can see it has the pace, and they're starting to grow in confidence to add more complexity and more details to the aerodynamic package, which bodes very well because I know McLaren are very good at producing developments in season, and they're starting to look very competitive and potentially could be nudging towards the front of the midfield by mid-season. Toro Rosso, the third of the team with new barge boards, and I'm in two minds to describe this as new barge boards or not. If we first of all look at the outline shape of the barge boards, it's almost identical in complete outline to what was there before, but actually the detail within this lined section is completely different. So I think we would be quite fair to call these a new barge board package, even if some of the outlines do remain the same. So what they've done is they've kept the carcellations on the top of the barge boards, they've kept very much the same footplate set up, even the little vertical vane that sits on the footplate is retained very much the same. But what they've done is broken up the one large curved barge board vane into 3 separate vanes, so much so that each of the separations has these aluminium stays just to support the structure of the barge board as the air is flowing over it. Obviously a lot of force is applied to these elements when cars are going up to 200 miles an hour. Now the reason for this split change on the barge board is the more edges that you get on an aerodynamic surface, the more it can then start to spill out more vortices, the more that you get airflow flowing exactly where you want around these surfaces, which means that the barge board effect creating the outwash pushing the front tyre wake away from the car, and equally, as I said before, the airflow under the car, which is another key factor for barge boards, just changes, becomes more powerful, and we're seeing consistent changes race by race now from Toro Rosso, which gives us a feeling that equally that they are now starting to find confidence in their aero package, trying to see what they'll be doing with the car going forwards, and again bodes well for the car becoming more competitive through the season with these updates. Now lastly, in terms of updates on the cars in Bahrain, is Racing Point. Now we recall back to Melbourne where they brought their big aero update for 2019, wasn't able to get that onto the car through testing, but that arrived very late, just in time for Melbourne. And through Friday practice, wasn't so much that they were running new parts on the car, but it was quite interesting. They did a lot of work running back-to-back tests on the car, putting the old mirrors, some other aspects of the old aero on the car, just to make sure that the data that they picked up from their simulations and what they saw in a very short weekend in Melbourne is being backed up with back-to-back tests. So we see the mirrors were changed, and often we saw Perez running with the old twin mount mirrors rather than the 2019 spec mirrors. The other change, which I didn't actually notice when we were looking at all the other changes the car had in Melbourne, was the screen. Now there's a little windscreen just on the front of the cockpit entry template where the steering wheel sits, and that is there not for performance aerodynamics, but for actually the aerodynamics to benefit the driver's head, because the air flows over the front of the car and then it goes over the open space of the cockpit. The driver's head gets a lot of buffeting, and they just tweak the front windscreen in order to make the driver more comfortable at high speed so his helmet isn't being bashed about too much. Normally this is just a straight screen, but we saw a few years ago, sort of 2014 time, Nico Rosberg had this jagged screen fitted, and he just found that the way that the airflow was broken up by these serrated screens just gave him less buffeting. Hamilton, a couple of years later, followed suit. We saw last year Haas running a serrated windscreen as well. Now Force India are doing this. So just have a look at the front of the car and you'll just see, again, it's not a performance, it's not adding lap time, it's just making the driver more comfortable in the car, and other teams play with stuff like this as well. Don't expect that will now change through the rest of the season.